Hi, everyone. I'm Hallie, and what I'm about to share with you will shake you to your core. This is the story of how my own family orchestrated the most calculated betrayal I could never have imagined, and how I discovered that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones plotting your downfall behind closed doors. You think you know what family betrayal looks like? You think you've heard it all? Trust me, you haven't. Because what happened to me goes beyond ordinary family drama. This is about manipulation so sophisticated, so methodically planned, that it would make a con artist jealous. And the most chilling part? It was wrapped in the language of love and support. Picture this. It's a stormy Tuesday evening in April, and I'm in my downtown Chicago penthouse, not just any apartment, but a $2.3 million loft that I'd spent 8 grueling years building my tech consulting empire to afford. Every marble countertop, every piece of custom furniture, every carefully curated art piece represented blood, sweat, and countless 18-hour workdays. I'd just closed a 6-figure deal with a Fortune 500 company, and I was finally ready to celebrate with that $300 bottle of champagne I'd been saving, when my phone rang with the call that would destroy everything. Mom. But this wasn't just any call. Her voice had this particular quality that made my blood run cold. You know that tone when someone's about to deliver news that will obliterate your world? That artificial sweetness that barely conceals something sinister underneath? Hallie, darling, she purred. And I should have hung up right there because my mother never purred. I need you to come to the house tonight. There's something we need to discuss as a family. Something important. Now, let me paint you the real picture of my family dynamics, because this backstory is crucial to understanding the level of psychological warfare I was about to walk into. I'm 34, the eldest daughter, and I've been the family's emotional and financial safety net since I was 16 years old. While my younger sister Madison, 3 years younger and possessing the kind of manipulative charm that could make a snake jealous, was busy burning through college funds, crashing cars, and leaving a trail of unpaid debts in her wake. I was the one holding everything together. Madison wasn't just the golden child. She was the family project. The one everyone made excuses for. The one whose failures were reframed as finding her path. The one who could set the house on fire and somehow convince everyone it was actually a really creative way to redecorate. She'd spent the last decade cycling through careers like most people cycle through Netflix shows: fashion blogger, yoga instructor, life coach, jewelry designer, social media influencer, always starting with grand announcements and ending with quiet disappearances and requests for just a little help getting back on my feet. And me? I was the responsible one, the achiever. The one who worked 70-hour weeks to build a tech consulting firm that specialized in digital transformation for major corporations. The one who'd paid for Dad's experimental cancer treatment when insurance wouldn't cover it. The one who'd co-signed Madison's student loans, covered her rent more times than I could count, and somehow always found myself apologizing for not doing enough. But here's what I didn't understand then, what took me years to figure out, was that my role in this family wasn't daughter or sister. It was ATM with emotions. I was the resource they'd learned to manage, manipulate, and ultimately extract from. So when Mom called that Tuesday night with that artificially sweet voice, asking me to drive 50 minutes through Chicago traffic to their mansion in Lake Forest for an important family discussion, every instinct in my body was screaming danger. But did I listen? Of course not. Because that's what good daughters do, right? They show up when called, no matter what red flags are waving in their faces. The drive to Lake Forest felt like driving to my own execution. The storm was getting worse. lightning crackling across the sky like nature itself was trying to warn me about what was coming. I kept replaying Mom's tone, too controlled, too practiced, like she'd rehearsed this phone call multiple times before making it. But here's the detail that should have sent me straight home. When I called to confirm I was coming, Dad answered Mom's phone. Dad, who never answered Mom's phone because he claimed he couldn't figure out how her iPhone worked. Dad, who was clearly sitting right there, waiting for my response. This wasn't spontaneous. This was coordinated. When I pulled up to their sprawling colonial at 8 p.m. sharp, because punctuality was one of those family values that only applied to me, I immediately noticed something that made my stomach drop. Madison's car wasn't just there. It was parked in my usual spot. The spot I'd been parking in since I got my driver's license. The spot that had somehow become mine through 15 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The most unsettling part was that every light in the house was on. Every single one. Like they were hosting some kind of event. Like they were putting on a show. I walked up the stone pathway, past Mom's prize-winning rose garden, and I could hear voices inside. Not just my parents and Madison. Other voices. Adult voices. Strangers' voices. What kind of family discussion required an audience? The front door opened before I could even ring the bell. Mom stood there in a navy blazer and pearls. Pearls. At 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. With a smile so bright it could power the Chicago skyline. Behind her, I could see people I didn't recognize sitting in our formal living room. The room we only used for special occasions. "Hallie!" she exclaimed, like my arrival was the most delightful surprise, even though she'd literally summoned me here an hour ago. "Come in, come in. Everyone's so excited to meet you." Everyone? Who was everyone? And why did they need to meet me? I stepped into the foyer, and that's when I saw the setup. The formal living room had been arranged like a business meeting. There was a man in an expensive suit sitting in Dad's usual chair. Dad was relegated to the sofa like a guest in his own home. There was a woman with a leather briefcase open on the coffee table. Documents spread out like she was running some kind of presentation. And there, perched on the edge of the settee like she was posing for a magazine shoot, was Madison. But this wasn't the Madison I knew. This wasn't the Madison who usually showed up to family gatherings in yoga pants and yesterday's mascara. This was Madison 2.0. Professionally styled hair, a crisp white shirt that probably cost more than most people's rent, and a confidence that seemed borrowed from someone else's personality. "Hallie," Dad said, standing up with the kind of formal stiffness usually reserved for business presentations. "I'd like you to meet Robert Chen from First National Legal Services and Patricia Williams from Williams & Associates Property Management, a lawyer and a property manager, at a family dinner on a Tuesday night." The pieces started clicking together in my mind like a horrifying puzzle, but I wasn't ready to see the full picture yet. I shook hands with these strangers in my childhood home, noting how they seemed to know exactly who I was while I had no idea why they were there. "Please, sit down." The lawyer, Robert, gestured to the chair directly across from the coffee table. The chair that put me squarely in their line of sight, with my back to the only exit. Strategic positioning that felt more like an interrogation setup than a family meeting. Mom disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a tray of coffee and pastries from that expensive bakery downtown, the one she only bought from for major holidays or when she was trying to impress someone important. She was treating this like a business meeting, because that's exactly what it was. "So, Hallie," Patricia began, consulting a folder full of documents that somehow already had my name on them. "Your family has shared some really exciting news about a unique opportunity that could benefit everyone involved." There was that word again. Benefit. In my experience, When adults start talking about how something is going to benefit everyone, what they really mean is that it's going to benefit them and cost you everything. Madison leaned forward, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. It wasn't nervousness or excitement. It was calculation, like she was watching me very carefully, measuring my reactions, adjusting her strategy in real time. "Hallie," she said, and her voice had this quality I'd never heard before, like she was addressing a business associate rather than her sister. "You know how passionate I am about helping women who are transitioning through difficult life situations." I did know this, actually. Madison had been talking about starting some kind of women's empowerment nonprofit for the past 8 months. She'd mentioned it at Christmas dinner, brought it up during a few phone calls, even asked me for advice about grant writing and marketing strategies. I'd been supportive. I'd even offered to help with the website development and create a pro bono social media strategy. But here's what I should have paid attention to. Madison never followed through on anything. Ever. Her track record was littered with abandoned projects, half-finished ideas, and grand plans that fizzled out the moment they required actual work. "The thing is," Robert interjected, pulling out what looked like a formal contract, "Madison's organization has reached a critical juncture. She's been accepted into an accelerated nonprofit incubator program that only takes 12 organizations per year out of over 3,000 applicants." This was news to me. Madison hadn't mentioned any incubator program. "And," Patricia added, "the program requires participants to have a professional headquarters that meets specific criteria for location, size, and accessibility. It's actually quite prestigious. Most participants are established organizations that have been operating for years." I looked at Madison, trying to read her expression. She was nodding along like this was all old news to her. But something felt off. The Madison I knew couldn't even maintain a consistent workout routine, let alone navigate a competitive application process for a prestigious program. "That's amazing," I said carefully. "Congratulations, Madison. That sounds like a huge opportunity." "It is," Mom said, practically vibrating with excitement. "And that's where you come in, sweetheart." Here it comes, I thought. Whatever they'd orchestrated this entire evening to ask me, this is where they're going to drop the bomb. Robert slid a document across the coffee table toward me. "Your penthouse, Hallie, meets every single criterion for the incubator program's headquarters requirement, the location in River North, the square footage, the prestigious building. It's absolutely perfect for what Madison needs." I stared at the document without picking it up. The header read, "Temporary Property Usage Transfer Agreement," and my name was printed at the top in bold letters. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "It would be temporary," Madison said quickly, her voice taking on that slightly breathless quality she used when she was trying to sell someone on something. "Just for the duration of the incubator program, 18 months, maybe 2 years at most. Just until I can get the organization established and qualify for permanent funding for our own space. 2 years. They wanted me to give up my home for 2 years. And where exactly would I live during this temporary arrangement?" The silence that followed lasted about 3 beats too long, just long enough for me to understand that they'd spent a lot of time planning this conversation, but somehow hadn't considered this obvious question important enough to discuss. "Well," Mom said, and I could hear the rehearsed quality in her voice. "Grandma Rose has been so lonely since Grandpa died. You know how much she's been struggling with that big house all by herself. She's actually been saying how much she'd love to have someone there to keep her company. Grandma Rose, who lived in a 1950s ranch house in suburban Wheaton, 45 minutes from downtown Chicago on a good day. Whose idea of modern technology was a microwave that still had dials instead of digital buttons? Whose house still had the original Harvest Gold appliances and shag carpeting? They wanted me to move from a $2.3 million penthouse in one of Chicago's most desirable neighborhoods to my grandmother's dated ranch house in the suburbs so Madison could play nonprofit executive in my space. "You want me to give Madison my penthouse," I said, and I could hear my voice getting very quiet in that way it does when I'm trying to stay calm. "Not give," Patricia corrected quickly. "This would be a formal usage agreement with legal protections for all parties involved. Everything would be completely documented and above board." She slid another document across the table. This one was titled Residential Tenancy Protection Agreement, and it had signatures on it that I didn't recognize. "We've already had preliminary discussions with your building's management company," Robert explained. "They're fully supportive of the arrangement, provided all proper documentation is filed and approved." My building management company. They'd already talked to my building management company before talking to me. "You've been planning this," I said, and it wasn't a question. "We've been exploring options," Dad said carefully. "We wanted to make sure everything was feasible before bringing it to you. We didn't want to get anyone's hopes up if it wasn't going to work out." Get anyone's hopes up? Like I was supposed to be excited about being displaced from my own home? I looked around the room, at the lawyer and property manager who'd been hired to make this official, at my parents who couldn't quite meet my eyes, at Madison who was watching me with an expression that was becoming less sisterly and more predatory by the minute. And that's when it hit me, like a physical blow. I was the only person in this room who didn't know this was happening. Everyone else had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. This wasn't a family discussion or a request for help. This was a hostile takeover disguised as a family meeting. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. Another silence that lasted too long. "Does it matter?" Madison said. And for the first time that evening, I heard her real voice underneath the professional facade. "This is an incredible opportunity, Hallie. For me, yes, but also for all the women my organization is going to help. You've always said you believe in supporting other women. This is your chance to put your money where your mouth is. Put my money where my mouth is. Not support your sister or help family. Put my money where my mouth is." Like this was a transaction instead of a relationship. Robert pulled out a pen, an expensive-looking pen, the kind lawyers use to sign important documents, and placed it next to the contract. "The incubator program needs a commitment by this Friday. If Madison is going to secure her spot, we need to have all the paperwork finalized and submitted by end of business." Friday. It was Tuesday night. They were giving me 3 days to decide whether to give up my home. But here's what made my blood run cold: the way Patricia was looking at me, not like someone waiting for my decision, but like someone who already knew what that decision was going to be. Like this was all just a formality. "What if I say no?" I asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Why would you say no?" Mom asked, and her voice had lost all its artificial sweetness. "This is Madison's chance to finally make something of herself. This could change her entire life." "And what about my life?" "Your life is already established," Dad said. "You're successful. You're financially secure. You have options. Madison doesn't have what you have. Madison doesn't have what I have because Madison never worked for what I have," I wanted to say, but I could see from their faces that this wasn't a conversation where logic was going to matter. "I need time to think about this," I said, standing up and leaving the contract unsigned on the coffee table. "Of course," Robert said smoothly. But remember, the deadline is firm. The incubator program won't extend their timeline for individual applicants. As I walked toward the door, I heard Madison say something that stopped me cold. Mom, should I start packing this week? I want to be ready to move in as soon as the paperwork is finalized. Start packing. Like my answer was already a given. I drove back to my penthouse through the storm, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind reeling from what had just happened. But it wasn't until I was riding the elevator up to my floor that the full scope of their betrayal hit me. This wasn't about Madison's nonprofit. This wasn't about helping women in transition or supporting family or any of the noble-sounding justifications they'd dressed it up in. This was about taking what I'd built and giving it to someone who hadn't earned it. This was about redistributing my success to make up for Madison's failures. This was about using love and family loyalty as weapons to manipulate me into giving up everything I'd worked for. And the most chilling part? They'd planned it all behind my back, hired professionals to make it legal, and then presented it to me like it was a gift I should be grateful to give. As I stood in my penthouse that night, looking out at the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows I'd dreamed of owning since I was 25, I realized something that would change everything. My family didn't see me as a person with my own dreams and needs and boundaries. They saw me as a resource to be managed. And they'd just made their first move to extract everything they could from me. The question was, what was I going to do about it? So there I was, standing in my penthouse at 2 a.m., still wearing the clothes I'd thrown on for what I thought was going to be a simple family dinner, staring out at the Chicago skyline and trying to process the sophisticated level of betrayal I'd just witnessed. But here's what I didn't know yet. What I was about to discover over the next few days was that the evening at my parents' house wasn't the beginning of their plan. It was the grand finale of a scheme that had been months in the making. And I was about to find out just how deep this rabbit hole went. The next morning, I woke up with that sick feeling you get when your subconscious processes trauma while you sleep. You know that moment when you first open your eyes and for about 3 seconds, everything feels normal, then reality comes crashing back, like a freight train. That was Wednesday morning for me. I made coffee with shaking hands and tried to think logically about what had happened, but every time I replayed the scene from the night before, new details jumped out at me. The way Patricia, the property manager, had seemed so familiar with my building's policies, the way Robert, the lawyer, had known exactly which documents to prepare, the way Madison had looked so prepared. That's when I decided to do something I'd never done before. I called in sick to work. I know that sounds minor, but understand? I hadn't taken a sick day in 3 years. I was the person who worked through the flu, who took client calls from hospital waiting rooms, who answered emails during family vacations. But something told me I needed to dig deeper into what was really happening, and thank God I did, because what I discovered that day changed everything. I started with the incubator program Madison had mentioned. 18 months. Only 12 organizations accepted out of 3,000 applicants. Prestigious nonprofit accelerator. It all sounded very impressive. So I Googled it. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I tried every combination of search terms I could think of. Chicago Nonprofit Incubator, Women's Empowerment Accelerator Program, 18-month nonprofit program. Nothing matched Madison's description. I found several legitimate programs in Chicago, but none that fit the criteria she'd mentioned. So I did what any normal person would do. I called them. Every single nonprofit accelerator program in the Chicago area. And here's what I found out. None of them had even heard of Madison, let alone accepted her into some exclusive program. The program didn't exist. But it got worse. So much worse. I decided to call my building's management company directly, not Patricia Williams, who'd been at the meeting. I wanted to talk to someone who didn't know about my family's little scheme. I reached the main office and asked to speak with the building manager. "Hi, this is Hallie Chen in Unit 3401, I said, using my professional voice. "I have some questions about temporary occupancy transfers." "Oh, Ms. Chen," the receptionist said, and I could hear her shuffling papers. "Perfect timing. I was just about to call you. We received the preliminary paperwork yesterday evening, and I wanted to confirm a few details about the transfer timeline." My blood turned to ice. "I'm sorry. What paperwork?" "The temporary occupancy transfer for Unit 3401 to Madison Chen? I have the documents right here, submitted by Williams and Associates on behalf of your family's legal representation." They had already submitted paperwork. Before I'd even made a decision, before I'd signed anything. "Can you tell me exactly what documents were submitted?" I asked, my voice somehow staying steady despite the fact that my entire world was tilting sideways. "Let me see. We have a family trust transfer request, a temporary guardianship notification, and a medical power of attorney designation. Everything looks to be in order, but we do need your signature on the final transfer documents by Friday to process the changeover for Monday. Medical power of attorney, family trust transfer, temporary guardianship. I never signed any of those documents," I said. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, oh my, Ms. Chen, I think you need to speak with our legal department immediately." I hung up and immediately called my bank. "Hi, this is Hallie Chen. I need to check for any unusual activity on my accounts, and I need to verify that no one else has been granted access to my financial information." What I found out made me physically nauseated. Someone had attempted to add Madison as an authorized user on my primary checking account. The request had been flagged because it required my physical signature, but it had been submitted with what appeared to be a power of attorney document. They weren't just trying to take my home. They were trying to access my finances. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by bank statements and legal documents I'd printed out, trying to understand the scope of what my family had attempted to do to me. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment request for help. This was identity theft. This was fraud. This was a coordinated effort to strip me of my assets and my autonomy. And then, my phone rang. "Hi, is this Hallie Chen?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Jennifer Martinez from Chicago Tribune's investigative team. I received some interesting information about a story we might want to pursue, and I was hoping to ask you a few questions." My heart started pounding. What? What kind of story? "Well, we got a tip about a young entrepreneur who's doing some really innovative work in the women's empowerment space. A Madison Chen? And apparently, she's been given this incredible penthouse headquarters by her family to help launch her nonprofit. It's exactly the kind of feel-good story our readers love. Family supporting family. Using privilege for good. That sort of thing." I felt like I was going to throw up. "The thing is," Jennifer continued, "when we tried to verify some of the details, we ran into some inconsistencies. The nonprofit isn't registered with the state yet. The incubator program she mentioned doesn't seem to exist, and the property records are confusing. I was hoping you could help clarify things, since you're listed as the property owner." Someone had pitched my story to the media. Someone had called a newspaper reporter and told them about Madison's amazing new venture and her generous family support system. They were planning to publicize this before I'd even agreed to it. "Ms. Martinez?" I said carefully. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding. Can I call you back in an hour?" After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and tried to wrap my mind around what was happening. They hadn't just planned to take my home, they'd planned to make it a public relations story. They were going to use the media to lock me into their narrative. Once it was published that I'd generously donated my penthouse to Madison's charitable cause, how could I possibly take it back without looking like a monster? This was psychological warfare at a level I'd never imagined my own family capable of. But I was about to discover it got even worse. That afternoon, I decided to drive to Grandma Rose's house. If they expected me to move in with her, I figured I should at least give her a heads up about what was supposedly happening. Plus, I needed to talk to someone who wasn't part of whatever conspiracy my immediate family had orchestrated. Grandma Rose lived in the same house she'd moved into when she got married in 1952. It was a modest ranch-style home with original hardwood floors, floral wallpaper, and the kind of lived-in comfort that only comes from 70 years of happy memories. She answered the door in her garden clothes, dirt under her fingernails and a smile that always made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. "Hallie, what a lovely surprise," she said, pulling me into one of those hugs that actually heals something inside you. "Come in, come in. I just made iced tea." We sat in her sunny kitchen, surrounded by the ceramic roosters she'd been collecting since before I was born, and I tried to figure out how to explain what was happening. "Grandma," I started carefully, "has anyone in the family talked to you recently about me coming to stay here for a while?" Her face immediately shifted, and I saw something I'd never seen in Grandma Rose's expression before: guilt. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "Yes, your mother called yesterday morning. She said you were going through a difficult time and needed a place to stay while you sorted things out." A difficult time. Sorted things out. What exactly did she tell you? Grandma Rose set down her iced tea and looked at me with the kind of directness that only comes from 8 decades of life experience. "She said you'd been having some financial troubles with your business, and that you might need to sell the penthouse. She said Madison was going to help by taking over the payments temporarily, and that you needed somewhere supportive to stay while you got back on your feet." Financial troubles? Madison taking over payments? Getting back on my feet? They had created an entire alternative narrative about my life. According to their version, I wasn't a successful business owner being manipulated into giving up my home. I was a struggling entrepreneur being rescued by my generous family. "Grandma," I said, my voice very quiet, "none of that is true. My business is doing better than it's ever done. I have no financial problems, and Madison isn't taking over my payments. They want me to give her my penthouse for free so she can start a nonprofit." Grandma Rose's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, understanding, and then something that looked like rage. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that they lied to me to get me to go along with this?" "I think they lied to everyone, Grandma, including me." That's when she told me something that made the whole picture finally come into focus. "Hallie, your mother didn't just call yesterday. She's been calling for weeks. At first, it was just to check in and see how I was doing. Then she started mentioning how worried she was about you, how much stress you were under, how she thought you might be having some kind of breakdown from working too hard." A breakdown. They'd been laying the groundwork for weeks, creating a narrative where I was mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. A narrative that would justify taking control of my life for my own good. She even suggested that maybe I should be prepared to help with some kind of intervention if you became too resistant to accepting help. An intervention. They were planning to frame my refusal to give up my home as evidence of mental illness that required family intervention. Grandma Rose reached across the table and took my hands. Honey, I want you to know that I never believed a word of it. You've been the most responsible person in this family since you were 12 years old. If your mother thinks you're having a breakdown, it's because she doesn't know who you really are. I started crying then, not the pretty, dignified tears you see in movies, but the ugly, shoulder-shaking sobs that come from having your entire reality shifted underneath you, because sitting in my grandmother's kitchen, I finally understood what was happening. My family wasn't just taking my home. They were stealing my reputation, my mental health, my autonomy, and my relationships. They were systematically destroying every aspect of my identity so they could rebuild me as someone who needed their help instead of someone who had succeeded beyond their expectations. And they were using the people I loved most, like Grandma Rose, as unwitting accomplices in their scheme. But here's what they didn't count on. Grandma Rose was nobody's accomplice. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, handing me tissues and refilling my iced tea like we were planning a garden party instead of exposing a family conspiracy. That evening, I drove back to my penthouse with a plan, not just to protect myself, but to expose exactly what my family had tried to do, because I realized that if they were willing to do this to me, they'd probably done it to other people too. And they'd definitely do it again if they thought they could get away with it. I spent that night documenting everything, every phone call, every document, every lie they'd told to different people. I took screenshots of the non-existent incubator program they'd referenced. I printed out the fraudulent paperwork that had been submitted to my building management. I saved the voice message from the Tribune reporter who'd been fed their false story. But most importantly, I started making calls. I called every family member, every friend, every professional contact who might have been told some version of the "Hallie is having problems" narrative, and what I found out was staggering. Madison had been telling people for months that I was struggling with my business and might need to downsize my lifestyle. Mom had been mentioning to relatives that she was worried about my workaholic tendencies and thought I might be burning out. Dad had apparently told his golf buddies that he was concerned I was too isolated and might benefit from spending more time with family. They had been character assassinating me for months, laying the groundwork for this moment when they would swoop in and rescue me from my own success. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated who I really was, because the Hallie they thought they knew, the compliant daughter, the supportive sister, the family resource who could be managed and manipulated. That person never existed. She was a role I'd been playing for so long that even I thought she was real. But the real Hallie was someone who'd built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing. Someone who'd navigated hostile corporate environments and come out on top. Someone who'd earned everything she had through intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking. And the real Hallie was about to remind my family exactly who they were dealing with. By Thursday evening, I had everything I needed: documents, recordings, witness statements, media contacts, and most importantly, a lawyer of my own, someone who specialized in family fraud and financial abuse. Her name was Sarah Kim, and she was exactly the kind of attorney you want in your corner when your own family declares war on you. Brilliant, ruthless, and completely unimpressed by people who use emotional manipulation as a weapon. This is one of the most sophisticated cases of family financial abuse I've seen, she told me after reviewing all my documentation. But here's the good news. They documented everything. They were so confident they could manipulate you into compliance that they left a paper trail that basically constitutes a confession. And Hallie, what they attempted to do to you isn't just unethical, it's federal fraud. We're talking criminal charges if we want to pursue them. Friday morning, the day they needed my signature to finalize their scheme. I was ready, but I wasn't just ready to defend myself. I was ready to go on the offensive, because if my family wanted to play games with legal documents and media manipulation and character assassination, they were about to learn that I'd been playing in much bigger leagues than they realized. And I was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The war was just beginning, and they had no idea what they'd started. Friday morning arrived like the calm before a hurricane. I woke up at 5 a.m., not because I set an alarm, but because my body knew this was the day everything would change. Today was their deadline. Today was supposed to be the day I signed away my life and handed over everything I'd worked for to Madison's fake nonprofit empire. Instead, today was the day I declared war. I got dressed like I was preparing for the most important business meeting of my life, because in many ways, I was black suit, red lipstick, the diamond earrings I'd bought myself when I landed my first seven-figure client. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Gone was the accommodating daughter who always put family peace above her own needs. In her place stood someone who looked like she could dismantle corporations before breakfast. Sarah Kim had spent Thursday night preparing what she called nuclear options, legal documents that would not only protect me, but would expose every illegal thing my family had attempted to do. She'd also made some calls to contacts in law enforcement because, as she'd explained, when families commit fraud this sophisticated, they rarely stop at one victim. That phrase had been haunting me all night. One victim. How many other people had my family done this to? How many times had they used love and manipulation to steal from people who trusted them? But I was about to find out, because Sarah had discovered something during her background research that made my blood run cold. At 8 a.m. sharp, my phone rang. Mom. Right on schedule. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear the artificial cheerfulness that meant she was nervous. "I hope you slept well. Are you ready for our meeting this morning?" Our meeting, like I was the one who had called this gathering. "Actually, Mom, I've been doing some research about Madison's incubator program. Very interesting stuff." Silence. Just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. "Oh? What kind of research?" "Well, for starters, the program doesn't exist. I called every nonprofit accelerator in Chicago. None of them have heard of Madison, and none of them match the description you gave me." Another pause. "Hallie, I think there might be some confusion." "There's no confusion. Mom, I also spoke with my building management company. Apparently, legal documents were submitted in my name without my knowledge or consent. That's called fraud." "Sweetheart, you're overreacting." And then I talked to Grandma Rose. Fascinating conversation. Did you know she thought I was having a mental breakdown? Apparently, you've been calling her for weeks, preparing her to participate in some kind of intervention if I didn't cooperate with your plan. The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. "Hallie," she finally said, and her voice had lost all its artificial warmth. "You need to come to the house this morning. We need to discuss this as a family." "Oh, we're definitely going to discuss this, but not at your house, and not on your terms. I'll see you at 10 a.m. "Where?" "You'll find out." I hung up and immediately called Sarah. "It's time." The location I'd chosen for our confrontation wasn't random. Sarah had suggested we meet at the offices of First National Legal Services, the same law firm that had provided Robert Chen for my family's scheme. Because here's what we discovered during our investigation. Robert Chen didn't just happen to be available for my family's fake legal needs. He was Madison's boyfriend. Not ex-boyfriend. Current boyfriend. had been for 8 months. The same Robert Chen who had sat in my parents' living room, presenting himself as an impartial legal professional helping with a family matter, was actually Madison's romantic partner and co-conspirator in a scheme to defraud me of millions of dollars in assets. That little detail was about to become very important. At 9:45 a.m., I walked into the marble lobby of First National Legal Services with Sarah beside me and a briefcase full of evidence that would destroy my family's carefully constructed lies. The receptionist looked confused when I announced that I was there for the Chen family matter, but she directed us to conference room A. My parents arrived at exactly 10 a.m., followed closely by Madison and Robert. The look on Robert's face when he saw Sarah sitting at the conference table was worth everything I'd been through. Pure panic, barely concealed behind a mask of professional composure. "Hallie," Dad said, taking his seat across from us, "I'm not sure why you felt it necessary to involve an outside attorney in a family matter." "Because this stopped being a family matter the moment you committed fraud," Sarah replied calmly, opening her briefcase. "My name is Sarah Kim, and I specialize in family financial abuse and conspiracy cases, which is exactly what we're dealing with here." Madison tried to interrupt. "This is ridiculous. We're trying to help Ms. Chen," Sarah continued, not even looking at Madison. "You can speak when I'm finished. Right now, you need to listen very carefully, because I'm about to explain exactly how much legal trouble you're all in." She spread documents across the conference table like she was dealing cards. "Let's start with the basics. Submitting false documentation to a property management company with intent to defraud. That's a felony. Attempting to add unauthorized users to bank accounts using forged power of attorney documents. Also a felony. Creating fictional business entities to support fraudulent claims. Another felony." Robert cleared his throat. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about the legal documentation. Mr. Chen." Sarah's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm particularly interested in your role in this conspiracy, given that you failed to disclose your romantic relationship with Madison Chen when you presented yourself as independent legal counsel to the family. That's not just fraud. That's professional misconduct that will end your career." The color drained from Robert's face. Madison looked like she was going to be sick, but Sarah wasn't finished. "However, the financial fraud and professional misconduct are actually the least of your problems. Because during my investigation into this matter, I discovered something very interesting about Madison's previous business ventures." She pulled out another folder, this one significantly thicker than the first. "It seems this isn't the first time Madison has created fictional businesses to defraud family members and romantic partners. Over the past 5 years, she's started 17 different LLCs, all of which were dissolved within 6 months of their creation, but not before collecting significant startup investments from trusting friends and family members." My mother's face went white. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about $340,000 in documented fraud across multiple victims. The yoga studio that never opened but collected $45,000 in pre-memberships. The sustainable fashion line that took custom orders totaling $67,000 and never delivered a single item. The life coaching certification program that charged $89,000 in tuition fees and never provided any actual training." Sarah turned to look directly at Madison, who was now visibly shaking. "Should I continue? Because I have documentation for every single one, bank records, victim statements, even some very interesting text messages between you and Robert about how to manage the family resources more effectively." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my penthouse. This was Madison's business model. She created elaborate schemes to defraud people who loved her, and when one scheme collapsed, she moved on to the next victim. The penthouse wasn't her business headquarters. It was her next con. And my parents weren't just her accomplices. They were her previous victims. How much? I asked quietly, looking at my mother. How much money has she taken from you? Mom started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen her use to get her way, but the broken sobs of someone who'd been living with a terrible secret for too long. The house, she whispered. We remortgaged the house 3 times. The retirement accounts. Your father's pension? Madison stood up abruptly. This is insane. You're all acting like I'm some kind of criminal. Sit down. Sarah's voice cut through the room like a blade. Because we're not done yet. She pulled out what looked like a recording device. One of Madison's previous victims was smart enough to record their conversations. This is from 6 months ago, when Madison was convincing her college roommate to invest $50,000 in her revolutionary meal planning app. She pressed play, and Madison's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. The thing about family money is that it's basically free money. You know? They feel guilty about asking for it back. So as long as you keep promising you'll pay them eventually, you can string them along for years. I've been working this angle with my parents since college. Hallie's going to be the biggest score yet. That penthouse is worth what? $2.3 million? Even if I only get 2 years out of it before she fights back. I can leverage it for enough startup capital to disappear and start fresh somewhere else. The silence in the room was deafening. That app, by the way, Sarah continued, never existed. Just like the incubator program doesn't exist. Just like the sustainable fashion line and the yoga studio and all the other ventures that Madison has used to systematically defraud everyone who's ever cared about her. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I saw her clearly. Not the struggling artist who needed support, not the ambitious entrepreneur who just needed the right opportunity, but a predator who had built her entire adult life around manipulating and stealing from people who loved her, and I'd been her next mark. So here's what's going to happen, Sarah said, gathering her documents back into neat piles. First, all fraudulent documentation related to Hallie's property and finances will be withdrawn immediately. Second, Madison will surrender any and all access to family financial accounts. Third, she will enter into a restitution agreement for all documented fraud over the past 5 years. And if we refuse? Robert asked, though his voice was barely a whisper. Sarah's smile was absolutely predatory. Then I file criminal charges Monday morning, and this entire conversation becomes evidence in a federal fraud investigation. Robert, you'll be disbarred and probably facing jail time. Madison, you'll be looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in federal prison. And Mr. and Mrs. Chen, your participation in this week's events makes you accessories to felony fraud. She stood up and smoothed her skirt like she'd just finished discussing the weather instead of dismantling my family's criminal enterprise. Or, she continued, you can sign these agreements. Madison can disappear from Hallie's life permanently, and we can all pretend this was just a very expensive lesson about family boundaries. Madison tried one last desperate play. Hallie, you can't do this to me. I'm your sister. We're family. I looked at her for a long moment, thinking about all the years I'd made excuses for her, all the times I'd bailed her out, all the ways I'd sacrificed my own needs to support her dreams. Dreams that, I now realized, had never been real. You're not my sister, I said quietly. Sisters don't systematically plan to destroy each other's lives. You're a stranger who happens to share my DNA, and you're a criminal who tried to steal everything I've worked for. I turned to my parents, who were still crying and looking like their entire world had just collapsed. Which, I suppose, it had. And you two? You stopped being my parents the moment you decided to help her do this to me. Real parents protect their children. They don't sacrifice one child to enable the other's criminal behavior. I stood up and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at the three people who had, until a week ago, been the most important relationships in my life. Sarah will be in touch with the paperwork. Don't contact me again. Any of you. And then I walked out of that conference room and out of their lives forever. In the elevator down to the lobby, Sarah looked at me with something that might have been pride. How do you feel? I thought about it for a moment. I'd just ended my relationship with my entire immediate family. I'd discovered that my sister was a career criminal and my parents were her willing accomplices. I'd learned that everything I thought I knew about the people I'd loved most was a lie. Free, I said finally. For the first time in my adult life, I feel completely free. Because that's what happens when you stop making excuses for people who see your love as a weakness to exploit. That's what happens when you realize that some relationships aren't worth saving. No matter how much history you share, that's what happens when you finally understand that the family you choose is infinitely more valuable than the family you're born into. 3 days later, all the paperwork was signed. Madison agreed to restitution payments that would take her 15 years to complete. Robert was placed on professional probation and removed from the case. My parents signed agreements never to access or attempt to access any of my financial or personal information. And I changed my phone number, moved to a different building, and started the process of building a life that belonged entirely to me. But the story doesn't end there. Because what I learned over the following months was that there were more victims than even Sarah had initially discovered. Madison's crimes stretched back almost a decade, involving dozens of people and hundreds of thousands of dollars in theft. And when those victims started coming forward, sharing their stories, supporting each other through the legal process, I realized something beautiful. Sometimes the worst betrayal leads you to the most authentic connections. The family I lost had been built on lies, manipulation, and exploitation. The family I found, the community of survivors who understood exactly what I'd been through, was built on truth, mutual support, and genuine care. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before I could build that new life, I had to deal with one final surprise from my biological family. A surprise that would test everything I thought I'd learned about standing up for myself. A surprise that would show me just how far some people will go when their carefully constructed world of lies finally collapses around them. 6 months after I walked out of that conference room and out of my family's lives forever, I thought the worst was behind me. I'd moved to a stunning new penthouse in Lincoln Park, this time with security measures that would make Fort Knox jealous. I'd changed my name legally to Hallie Rose Chen, honoring the one family member who'd shown me what real love looked like. My business was thriving beyond anything I'd imagined, partly because the experience had taught me to recognize manipulation and toxic dynamics in corporate settings, making me invaluable to companies dealing with internal fraud and corruption. Life was good, better than good. For the first time in my adult life, I was living authentically, making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would keep peace in a family that had never deserved my loyalty. But if there's one thing I've learned about toxic people, it's that they never really accept defeat. They just regroup, reorganize, and come back with a different strategy. The first sign that my family wasn't done with me came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in my home office, working on a proposal for a Fortune 100 client, when my doorman called up. "Ms. Chen, there's a woman here claiming to be your cousin. Says she has urgent family news and needs to speak with you immediately." My stomach dropped. I'd been very clear with building security that no one from my biological family was to be given access, under any circumstances. But a cousin. I had dozens of cousins on both sides of the family, and most of them had been kept in the dark about the full scope of what had happened between Madison and me. "What's her name?" I asked. "Emma Patterson. She seems very upset. Says it's about your grandmother." "Grandma Rose." My heart started racing. Emma was my dad's sister's daughter, someone I'd always had a good relationship with but hadn't spoken to since the family explosion. If she was here about Grandma Rose. "Send her up." 3 minutes later, Emma was standing in my living room, and I could see immediately that something was very wrong. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands were shaking, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Hallie," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I am so sorry to bother you. I know there's been some kind of family fight, but I didn't know who else to turn to. What happened? Is Grandma Rose okay?" Emma started crying again. "That's just it. I don't know. No one will tell me anything, but something's happening. And I think Madison and your parents are involved." She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages. "This started 3 weeks ago. Madison reached out to me, said she was worried about Grandma Rose living alone in that big house. Said the family was concerned about her mental state, that she might be developing dementia or depression." I felt that familiar chill of recognition, the same character assassination playbook they'd tried to use on me. She asked if I'd noticed anything concerning about Grandma's behavior lately. Said your parents were thinking about getting some kind of professional assessment done, maybe looking into assisted living options. And what did you tell her? That Grandma Rose seemed fine to me. I mean, she's 86, so she's slowed down a bit, but she's still sharp as a tack. Still driving, still managing her own finances, still hosting her book club every month. There's absolutely nothing wrong with her mental state. Emma showed me more messages. But then Madison started sending me these articles about elder abuse, about how families sometimes have to make difficult decisions to protect vulnerable seniors. She kept asking if I thought Grandma might be susceptible to outside influence, or if I'd noticed any concerning financial decisions. My blood was turning to ice as I read through Madison's messages. It was the same psychological manipulation she'd tried with me, but this time she was targeting a vulnerable 86-year-old woman. "Emma, when's the last time you actually spoke to Grandma Rose? That's what's so weird. I've been trying to call her for 2 weeks, but I keep getting voicemail. And when I drove by her house last weekend, there was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. When I knocked, no one answered, but I could see lights on inside." "What kind of car?" "Silver SUV, kind of like the one Madison drives." I was already reaching for my phone to call Sarah Kim, because if Madison was targeting Grandma Rose, the one person in my family who'd shown me unconditional love and support, then this had moved beyond simple fraud into something much more dangerous. "Emma, I need you to tell me everything. Every conversation you've had with Madison, every message, every detail you can remember." What Emma told me over the next hour painted a picture of a scheme so calculated and vicious that it made their plan to steal my penthouse look like amateur hour. Madison had been systematically contacting extended family members for months, planting seeds of concern about Grandma Rose's mental health and living situation. She had been particularly focused on relatives who lived far away and didn't see Grandma regularly. People who might be convinced to support interventions based on secondhand information. But the most chilling part was what Emma told me next. "Yesterday, I got a call from someone claiming to be from Adult Protective Services. They said they'd received reports of possible elder abuse or neglect, and they wanted to ask me some questions about Grandma Rose's living situation. Did you talk to them? No. I told them I'd call back after I spoke with other family members. But Hallie, what if it wasn't really APS? What if it was someone Madison hired to make those calls? I was already dialing Sarah's number. Because if Madison was impersonating government officials or filing false reports with social services, she'd crossed a line that would put her in federal prison for a very long time. Sarah answered on the first ring. Hallie, what's wrong? Madison's targeting my grandmother. I need you to meet me at Grandma Rose's house immediately. I'll be there in 30 minutes. And Hallie? Call the police. If there's any chance she's being held against her will or coerced in any way, this is a criminal matter. The drive to Grandma Rose's house was the longest 45 minutes of my life. Emma followed in her car, and we'd arranged to meet Sarah at the corner before approaching the house together. But as we turned onto Grandma's street, I immediately saw the silver SUV Emma had described. It was Madison's car, and there was a moving truck parked behind it. Oh my God, Emma whispered. Are they moving her out? I called 911 immediately. I need police at 1247 Maple Street in Wheaton. I have reason to believe an elderly resident is being moved against her will by family members who are attempting to defraud her. The dispatcher told us to wait at the corner until police arrived, but through Grandma's front windows, I could see people moving around inside, large shapes being carried out, furniture being loaded into the truck. They were stealing everything she owned. When the police arrived, followed closely by Sarah, I explained the situation as quickly as I could. The officers approached the house while we waited on the sidewalk, and what happened next was like watching a crime show unfold in real time. Madison answered the door with a bright smile and a story already prepared. Grandma Rose had decided to move into assisted living, she explained. The family was just helping her pack up and transition to a safer environment. She had all the paperwork. She assured them, power of attorney, medical directives, everything completely legal and above board. But then, one of the officers asked to speak with Grandma Rose directly. And that's when Madison's story started falling apart. She's resting, Madison said. The move has been very stressful for her, and her doctor suggested she take something to help her sleep. Ma'am, we're going to need to see Mrs. Rose and verify that she's participating in this move voluntarily. Of course. Of course. She gets confused sometimes. The dementia, but I have medical documentation of her condition. Medical documentation of dementia. That didn't exist. The officers insisted on entering the house, and what they found inside made my heart break into a million pieces. Grandma Rose was sitting in her living room, the living room that had been completely emptied except for one chair, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. But when she saw me walk in behind the police officers, her face lit up with recognition and relief. Hallie, oh, thank God. I was hoping you'd come. Madison immediately tried to interrupt. Grandma, you're confused? We talked about this, remember? The nice facility with the gardens you liked? But Grandma Rose looked directly at the police officer and said, in a voice that was completely clear and lucid, I never agreed to move anywhere. I told them I wanted to stay in my own home, and they said if I didn't cooperate, they'd have me declared incompetent and move me anyway. That's when the police officer turned to Madison and asked to see those legal documents she'd mentioned. What Madison produced was the most sophisticated set of forged legal documents I'd ever seen. Power of attorney forms with Grandma Rose's signature, signatures that looked real but had been forged. Medical assessments declaring her mentally incompetent, assessments from doctors who didn't exist. Court orders authorizing the family to make decisions on her behalf. Court orders from cases that had never been filed. The forgeries were good. Really good. Good enough to fool a moving company, a storage facility, even a care home admissions office. But they weren't good enough to fool Sarah Kim, who had experience with exactly these kinds of elder fraud cases. These documents are completely fabricated, Sarah told the police officers. The court case numbers don't exist, the medical licenses are fake, and the notary stamps are counterfeit. This is identity theft, fraud, and elder abuse on a massive scale. That's when Madison made her final, desperate play. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Hallie, you have to understand. I was trying to protect her. Mom and Dad said you'd cut off the whole family, that you didn't care what happened to any of us. They said Grandma Rose was being influenced by you, that you were planning to take advantage of her financially." Even in her moment of complete defeat, Madison was still trying to manipulate the situation, still trying to make herself the victim and me the villain. But Grandma Rose wasn't having it. "Madison," she said, her voice sharp with 86 years of accumulated wisdom. "I've known you since you were born, and you've been a liar and a manipulator since you could talk. Don't you dare try to blame Hallie for your criminal behavior." The police arrested Madison on the spot. Fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, forgery. The charges just kept stacking up. They also arrested the two men who'd been loading the moving truck, who turned out to be associates of Robert Chen's law firm. But the most shocking arrest came when they discovered that my parents had been sitting in a car around the corner the entire time, waiting to see if Madison's plan would work. They'd been there for hours, watching their elderly mother-in-law's life be dismantled, ready to swoop in and comfort her once she'd been successfully displaced from her home. The level of premeditation, of cold calculation, was breathtaking. Over the following weeks, as the criminal investigation unfolded, we learned the full scope of what Madison had planned. She hadn't just been targeting Grandma Rose's house, she'd been systematically working to gain control of all her assets, bank accounts, investment portfolios, even her life insurance policies. The plan was to have Grandma Rose declared incompetent, move her into the cheapest possible care facility, and liquidate everything she owned. Madison estimated she could extract nearly $800,000 from an 86-year-old woman whose only crime was loving her family unconditionally. But here's what Madison hadn't counted on: Emma's concern, my willingness to fight back, and Grandma Rose's own inner strength. During the trial, because yes, this all went to trial, Grandma Rose testified against Madison with a clarity and dignity that left the entire courtroom in awe. She described months of psychological manipulation, threats, and coercion. She talked about being told that her own granddaughter didn't love her anymore, that her family thought she was becoming a burden, that her only option was to cooperate with their plans for her future. But she also testified about the moment she realized what was really happening. "I knew something was wrong," she told the jury, her voice steady despite her 86 years. "When Madison told me that Hallie had said I was getting too old to manage my own affairs, because the real Hallie, my Hallie, would never say anything like that. She would talk to me directly, respectfully, like the adult I've been for 8 decades. That's when I knew this wasn't about helping me, this was about stealing from me. And that's when I started writing down everything they said and did, because I knew someone needed to document their lies." Madison was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. My parents received 5 years each for their roles in the conspiracy. Robert Chen was disbarred and sentenced to 7 years. But the most important outcome wasn't their punishment, it was what happened after. Grandma Rose moved in with me, not because she couldn't live independently, she absolutely could, but because we both realized that the family we'd thought we had was gone forever, and we wanted to build something new together. My penthouse became our penthouse. I converted the second bedroom into her private suite, and she transformed my sterile, modern kitchen into a space that always smelled like homemade bread and felt like love. We started hosting Sunday dinners for the family we chose instead of the family we were born into. Emma became a regular guest, along with Sarah and several other friends who understood that sometimes the most authentic relationships are the ones you build from scratch. We also started a foundation together, the Rose Chen Foundation for Elder Protection, dedicated to helping seniors who'd been targeted by family financial abuse. Because we learned that what happened to us wasn't unique. Elder fraud by family members is one of the fastest growing crimes in America, and it's devastating lives every single day. The foundation has helped recover over $3.2 million in stolen assets for elderly victims. We've lobbied for stronger legal protections, funded legal aid for seniors who can't afford representation, and created educational programs to help families recognize the warning signs of financial abuse. But more than that, we've created a community, a network of survivors and supporters who understand that sometimes protecting yourself means walking away from people who share your DNA. Grandma Rose turned 87 last month, and we celebrated with a party that filled our entire penthouse with laughter, music, and people who genuinely care about each other. As I looked around at the chosen family we'd built together, Sarah and Emma, and dozens of other people who'd become part of our lives through shared values rather than shared genetics, I realized something profound. The family that tried to destroy me had actually given me the greatest gift possible. They'd forced me to discover who I really was when I stopped being who they needed me to be. I'm not the compliant daughter who sacrifices her own needs to keep everyone else comfortable. I'm not the supportive sister who enables criminal behavior in the name of family loyalty. I'm not the responsible one who carries everyone else's problems on her shoulders. I'm Hallie Rose Chen. I'm a successful entrepreneur, a protective granddaughter, a fierce advocate for justice, and a woman who knows the difference between love and manipulation. I'm someone who builds rather than tears down, who creates rather than destroys, who chooses kindness without allowing myself to be victimized. And I'm someone who learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction. To anyone listening who's dealing with family manipulation, financial abuse, or psychological warfare disguised as love, I want you to know this. You don't owe your sanity to anyone. You don't owe your success to people who want to tear you down. You don't owe your loyalty to family members who see your love as a weakness to exploit. You deserve relationships built on mutual respect, genuine care, and authentic support. You deserve to keep what you've earned, to live where you choose, and to make decisions based on your own needs and values. And if the people who claim to love you can't accept those boundaries, then they don't actually love you. They love what you provide for them. And that's not love at all. The penthouse I almost lost is still mine. But more importantly, the life I almost lost is now more authentically mine than it's ever been. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's discovering that you never needed their approval to be exactly who you were meant to be. And that's a lesson worth more than any amount of money they could have stolen. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Share your experiences in the comments. Tell me how you've navigated toxic family dynamics, or let me know what questions you have about protecting yourself from financial manipulation. Because the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to suffer in silence. Our stories matter. Our boundaries matter. And our freedom to choose our own families, biological or otherwise, matters more than any tradition or expectation that asks us to sacrifice our well-being for someone else's comfort. I'm Hallie Rose Chen, and this is my story of how losing my family helped me find myself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And remember, you're stronger than you know. braver than you feel, and worthy of relationships that celebrate rather than diminish who you are. The best chapters of your story are still being written. Make sure you're the one holding the pen.